One word, and you're dead." The voice was low, icy, and absolute. She froze at the doorway, her pulse pounding in her ears. In the dim light, the scene unfolded like a nightmare. Her daughter trembling and wide-eyed, the man's shadow looming over her, his hand poised in a grip that spoke louder than any scream. He didn't know she was there. Not yet. And in that heartbeat, she understood she was standing on the edge of a moment that would change everything. What followed would unravel secrets, shatter trust, and ignite a fight for justice that no one saw coming. Stay with us because this story will take you from that chilling moment to a verdict you won't forget. Subscribe now so you never miss our latest stories, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The words you just heard are only the first crack in the darkness. The hospital smelled faintly of antiseptic and overbrewed coffee, a scent Ma'am Diarra had grown used to in her 12 years as a nurse. However, tonight it clung to her scrubs like a shadow she couldn't shake. And as she walked the quiet corridor toward the exit, she thought about how the fluorescent lights always made everything feel colder than it should. She checked her phone, a text from Amira saying she'd finished her homework early and was waiting for dinner. And that single message made the corners of her mouth lift, because even on the longest shifts, coming home to her daughter was what kept her moving. Outside, the night air was crisp with the faint hum of street traffic, and she wrapped her coat tighter, crossing the parking lot under the orange glow of the lamps, already picturing the warmth of their small kitchen, the way Amira's laugh would echo against the tiled walls as they cooked together. She didn't notice the dark sedan idling a few rows away until she was at her car. But when she glanced over, she saw only the silhouette of someone behind the wheel and told herself it was nothing, just another late-night visitor leaving the hospital. Back in their neighborhood, the glow of porch lights and the faint scent of grilled food drifting from a nearby house gave the street its usual safe, lived-in feel. And as Mame stepped through her front gate, she spotted Mrs. Green from next door tending to her potted plants despite the chill. They exchanged a wave, a ritual that had become as steady as the sunrise, and Mrs. Green called out that she had fresh muffins for Amira tomorrow, which made Mame laugh and promised she'd send her daughter over in the morning. Inside, the house welcomed her with the soft hum of the heater and the faint floral scent from the candles Amira liked to light. And in the living room, she found her daughter curled up on the couch with a book, her legs tucked under a blanket, hair tied loosely back. "How was work?" Amira asked, glancing up with that quiet curiosity she'd always had. And Mamie told her it was busy, which was true, but left out the part about the car in the parking lot because it felt too insignificant to matter. They moved into their evening rhythm easily, Mame chopping onions while Amira set the table, the clatter of plates and the sizzle from the pan filling the air, and for a while, the world outside ceased to exist. Halfway through dinner, the doorbell rang, sharp and unexpected. And when Mame opened the door, there stood Jerome, tall, well-dressed, with the kind of easy smile that could lower anyone's guard. She'd met him a few weeks back at a neighborhood barbecue through Shanice, her oldest friend and a police officer, and while she had no intentions of starting anything serious, Jerome's warmth and attentiveness had been disarming. He brought a small bag of pastries, just because, claiming he'd been in the area and thought of them, and though Mame hesitated for a fraction of a second, she invited him in, noticing how Amira's gaze flickered before she excused herself to her room. Over coffee, Jerome spoke with the same charm he'd shown since the first day they met, asking about her work, making jokes that made her laugh despite herself. And though part of her appreciated the company, another part noticed how his eyes seemed to scan the house, lingering a moment too long on the hallway leading to the bedrooms. When Shanice dropped by unexpectedly to return a borrowed book, her presence shifted the room. Her eyes flicked from Jerome to Mame with a subtle frown that Mame caught but didn't address, because she wasn't ready to question why. Jerome excused himself soon after, with a promise to call, and as the door closed behind him, Shanice's first words were a quiet, "Be careful with him." Mame brushed it off, saying she was fine, but Shanice's tone stayed with her long after she'd gone, settling in the back of her mind like an unwelcome whisper. Later that night, after Amira had gone to bed, Mame lingered in the kitchen, the dishes washed but the lights still on, replaying the evening in her head, the sound of Jerome's voice, the way Amira's shoulders had stiffened when he arrived, and the sharp note in Shanice's warning. She told herself she was overthinking, that Amira was just shy around strangers, that Shanice's instincts as a cop made her suspicious by default. But even as she locked the front door, she couldn't quite shake the faint unease curling in her chest. Upstairs, she peeked into Amira's room to find her asleep, the blanket pulled high, one hand clutching the edge as if she needed to hold on to something. The sight made Mame's heart ache, and she closed the door gently, promising herself she'd ask her daughter about it in the morning. The night passed quietly, but in the early hours, a faint sound woke Mame. A soft creak from downstairs, followed by the subtle hum of a car engine fading into the distance. She checked the locks, finding them secure, and told herself it was nothing more than a neighbor leaving early for work. Still, when she returned to bed, it took longer than usual for sleep to come, and in those restless moments, she couldn't ignore the image of Jerome's eyes tracking the hallway, the memory of the idling sedan at the hospital, and the fact that her daughter hadn't smiled as easily tonight. She resolved to keep an eye on things, not yet realizing that the first cracks had already begun to form in the walls she thought were protecting them. Jerome's presence slipped into Mame's life like a shadow at dusk, soft enough to seem harmless, yet steady enough to never leave. He came by with coffee after her night shifts, carried grocery bags as if the weight meant nothing, and spoke with that measured calm that disarmed even the most guarded listener. The neighbors liked him instantly. Mrs. Ray across the street leaned over her fence, smiling whenever she saw him mow Mame's small patch of lawn, as though this act alone proved his worth. Mame watched from the kitchen window, arms folded, the scent of simmering stew filling the air, and wondered why she couldn't decide if she was grateful or unsettled. Amira kept her distance, drifting through the house with a quietness that used to mean she was deep in thought, but now felt like she was hiding in plain sight. The warmth in the home was intact on the surface, yet beneath it, something cold was pressing in. At the clinic, her colleagues teased her gently about Jerome, saying she deserved someone who brought her flowers in the middle of the week, who made her laugh even after 12 hours on her feet. She smiled for them, let the conversation pass like a warm breeze. But inside, the questions gnawed. Why did Amira excuse herself so quickly when he arrived? Why did Shanice's voice sharpen whenever his name came up? That evening, Jerome brought a small gift for Amira, a silver bracelet, delicate and gleaming under the dining room light. He fastened it on her wrist with a smile, telling her it was just because she was special. Mame noticed how Amira's shoulders stiffened under his touch, how her thank you came out in a whisper, almost lost under the clink of cutlery. It was the kind of moment that others might dismiss as shyness, yet for Mame it left a bitter aftertaste she couldn't shake. Days bled into weeks, and Jerome wove himself deeper into their routines. He cooked on Sundays, filling the kitchen with the scent of garlic and butter, his laughter rolling like it belonged there. He insisted on fixing the loose door hinge, replacing a flickering bulb in the hallway, and driving them to the store when it rained. The convenience was undeniable, and the way he spoke to others, polite, patient, warm, made her feel almost foolish for doubting. But Mame watched closely. She saw the flicker of irritation when Amira didn't respond quickly to his questions, the slight tightening of his jaw when Mame declined his offers to stay over. These were brief, almost imperceptible cracks in an otherwise perfect mask. When Shanice dropped by one Thursday afternoon, Jerome greeted her with that same warm charm, yet Mamie caught the way his eyes lingered on her too long, assessing. Later, as they stood in the kitchen while Jerome fetched drinks, Shanice leaned in and murmured, "You need to be careful, babe. Men like that play a long game." That night, Mame found herself lying awake, the rain tapping against the window, shadows shifting across the ceiling. She thought about Shanice's words, about the way Jerome's tone sometimes shifted when no one else could hear. Amira's door was closed, a thin line of light visible beneath it. Mame considered knocking but hesitated. She didn't want to force her daughter into a conversation she wasn't ready for. The thought that gnawed at her most was not knowing if she was imagining it all or if there was truly a darkness creeping in. At dinner the next day, Jerome suggested they all take a weekend trip to the coast, his voice smooth as he painted a picture of sunsets and seafood. Amira glanced at Mame with eyes that spoke volumes, and Mame quickly replied that her schedule wouldn't allow it. Jerome smiled in that slow way of his, as though her refusal was merely a small obstacle he could step over in time. Saturday brought a neighborhood barbecue at the park, the late summer air heavy with the scent of grilled meat and the hum of easy laughter. Jerome thrived in it, moving between groups, shaking hands, telling stories that made strangers lean in closer. Mame observed from a distance, a paper plate balanced in her hand, feeling as if she were watching a performance. Amira stayed close to her side, her small fingers brushing Mame's every so often, a silent tether. When Jerome finally joined them, his arm slipped casually around Mame's shoulders, the weight of it both protective and claiming. He asked Amira if she'd tried the dessert table, and when she shook her head, his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Mame caught it, quick, sharp, gone in a blink. It was the kind of moment that made her pulse quicken, though she forced herself to keep her breathing steady. Later that evening, while Mame was rinsing dishes, she overheard Jerome on the phone in the living room. His voice was low, urgent, the kind of tone one uses when they don't want to be overheard. She stepped closer, careful not to make the floorboards creak. She caught fragments, something about a meeting, something about it being handled, and then his voice softened as he ended the call, just in time to greet her with that easy smile. Her lips formed a polite question about his day, but inside a new unease had begun to take root. He didn't offer any details and she didn't press, though her mind kept turning over the pieces like jagged glass. By the end of the week, Memi noticed a subtle shift in herself. She no longer simply watched Jerome, she studied him, memorizing the way his moods changed like flickers of light across water. Amira was quieter than ever, her laughter rare and fleeting, and when it did surface, Jerome's presence seemed to smother it. Shanice called one evening, her voice steady but firm, reminding Mame that silence could be dangerous, that pretending not to see was the same as letting it happen. Mame stood in the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear, staring out at the street where Jerome's car sat under the dim glow of the street lamp, and she realized that the perfect facade wasn't built to last. It was built to trap. The thought chilled her more than she cared to admit, but she tucked it away for now, knowing the time to confront it hadn't yet come. The first sign came on a Tuesday evening, subtle enough that someone else might have missed it. But for Mame, it cut through like a shard of glass. She had just returned from the clinic, the smell of antiseptic still clinging to her clothes, when she noticed the living room lights dimmed and the television turned to a static-filled channel. Jerome sat in the armchair, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, watching Amira at the dining table as she worked on her homework. The smile he gave when Mame walked in was tight, his eyes shifting to her only after a beat too long. She asked if everything was fine, and his answer came too quickly, the kind of answer rehearsed before it was needed. Amira didn't look up, her pencil moving in quick, messy lines, the tip pressing hard enough to tear the paper. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were listening. By Thursday, Mame began to notice other small things. Amira's phone missing from her usual spot, replaced by an older model she didn't recognize. Jerome's jacket draped over the back of Amira's chair instead of the coat rack. When Mame asked about it, he laughed, saying he'd just been helping her with a school project. His tone was light, yet his eyes held a weight that suggested she shouldn't press further. That night, as Mame stood in the kitchen rinsing dishes, she could hear low voices from the hallway. Jerome's calm, measured murmur, and Amira's barely audible responses. She strained to make out the words, but the clink of ceramic under the tap drowned them out. When she stepped into the hallway, Jerome was gone, and Amira was in her room with the door shut. Mame's stomach tightened with a dread she didn't want to name, the kind that coils deep and refuses to loosen. Saturday brought an unexpected invitation. Jerome insisted on taking both of them to a late dinner at a new restaurant downtown. The place was dimly lit, all exposed brick and flickering candles, the air thick with the scent of seared meat and expensive wine. Jerome kept the conversation flowing, weaving compliments for Mame with questions aimed at Amira that seemed harmless on the surface. Yet each one carried a subtle undertone, probing at her thoughts, her routines, her friends. When Amira hesitated before answering, he would chuckle softly and change the subject. But Mamie noticed the way his hand tightened around his wineglass. She sat there smiling politely, feeling the weight of his presence pressing against the edges of her composure. By the time dessert arrived, Amira excused herself to the restroom, and Jerome leaned back in his chair, his voice lowering as he told Mame how much he valued keeping things in order. It was the kind of statement that seemed innocent in public, yet she couldn't shake the feeling it was meant as a warning. The following week, Mame came home earlier than usual, the evening sun still painting the walls in warm light. She pushed open the front door and froze. From the hallway she could hear muffled voices, Amira's sharp with fear, Jerome's steady and low. She stepped silently toward the sound, her heart pounding, palms damp. As she reached the corner, she saw them in the living room, Amira standing rigid, Jerome leaning too close, his hand resting on the back of her chair. His smile was thin, eyes locked on the girl's face. Mamie called out his name, and he straightened instantly, the expression shifting into something warmer, lighter, as though nothing had happened. He claimed they were discussing school, that Amira had been stressed. Amira nodded without meeting her mother's eyes, her voice barely a whisper. Mame knew then that something had crossed a line, though she kept her face neutral, storing the moment like evidence. In the days that followed, the tension became a constant undercurrent in the house. Jerome's visits were more frequent, his helpfulness sharper, almost intrusive. He reorganized the pantry without asking, adjusted the thermostat, and moved Mame's mail from the hallway table to his neat stack on the counter. Amira's bedroom door was often locked now, and when it wasn't, Mame would find her sitting cross-legged on the bed, staring at nothing, the silver bracelet from Jerome resting on the nightstand instead of her wrist. Shanice's call that Thursday felt almost prophetic. Her voice clipped, urging Mame to trust her instincts, to stop giving him the benefit of the doubt. Mame listened in silence, staring out the kitchen window where Jerome's car was parked, gleaming under the street lamp like it belonged there. Friday night shattered the illusion completely. Mame arrived home later than planned, the front door slightly ajar. She stepped inside quietly, sensing movement down the hall. The air felt thick, charged, carrying the faint scent of Jerome's cologne, mixed with something sour, fear. As she rounded the corner, she froze. Amira was sitting on the edge of her bed, hair disheveled, the blanket clutched tightly around her shoulders, her eyes wide and unblinking. Jerome stood behind her, shirt half-buttoned, one hand gripping the back of her neck, the other pressing the blanket against her chest as if to keep her in place. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but Mamie heard it clearly. One word, and you're dead. The words sliced through the air, cold and deliberate, wrapping the room in silence. Mame's mind raced, fear, fury, disbelief colliding all at once, yet her body moved without hesitation. She stepped forward, voice steady, calling his name as if announcing herself in enemy territory. Jerome straightened slowly, releasing Amira with a measured ease that made her skin crawl. He turned, smiling that same calm, disarming smile, claiming it was a misunderstanding, that he was only trying to calm her down after an argument. Amira's gaze flicked to her mother, the plea in her eyes louder than any scream. Mame kept her breathing even, knowing that one wrong move could turn the moment volatile. She told Amira to go to her room and close the door, her voice firm but not raised, every syllable balanced on the edge of control. When the door clicked shut, Mame faced Jerome, her heartbeat drumming in her ears. She didn't confront him outright. Instead, she told him it was late, that he should leave. He hesitated, eyes narrowing, but after a long, tense pause, he stepped past her, his shoulder brushing hers in a way that felt like a threat. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the house, leaving behind a silence so heavy it was almost suffocating. Mame stood in the hallway for a long moment, steadying herself before going to check on Amira, who sat curled on her bed, eyes red, fingers gripping the blanket as if it were the last thing keeping her grounded. The night after the threat, the house felt like a sealed chamber. Mame lay awake listening for every creak in the floorboards, every faint change in air pressure, as if danger might slip in through the cracks. Amira hadn't spoken more than a handful of words since Jerome left, her eyes darting toward the windows whenever a car passed outside. Mame told herself she'd keep things normal until she could plan her next move. But normal had already dissolved. Every shadow stretched too far. Every silence lasted too long. When dawn broke, she moved through the kitchen like an intruder in her own home, careful not to startle her daughter, careful not to invite suspicion from the man she now knew was a predator. 2 days later, Jerome returned, unannounced, his knock a steady rhythm that carried an unspoken command. Mame opened the door with a guarded smile, her mind racing through possibilities. Refuse him and risk his anger, or let him in and risk her daughter. She chose the latter, masking it as politeness, telling herself she needed to see more, to gather proof. He stepped inside as though he owned the air in the room, greeting Amira with a smooth voice that coiled around her name. The girl's shoulders tensed, yet she forced a small nod before retreating to the living room. Mamie kept her expression neutral, but her hands were tight fists inside her pockets. It was late afternoon when she caught it. She had stepped into the hallway to take a call from Shanice, lowering her voice so Jerome wouldn't hear. Shanice's tone was urgent, warning her again not to underestimate him, to act before it was too late. Mamie had just agreed when a flicker of movement in the reflection of the hallway mirror caught her eye, a shadow passing behind her toward Amira's room. She ended the call without a goodbye, her heartbeat spiking, her footsteps light as she followed. She paused outside the slightly open door, the muted light spilling into the hall, the muffled sound of Jerome's voice low and coaxing. Her stomach knotted as she pushed the door further, just enough to see. Jerome was leaning over Amira, one hand braced against the wall, the other hovering inches from her shoulder. His body blocked most of the light, casting them in half shadow, his smile a thin curve that didn't reach his eyes. Amira's back was pressed to the desk, her eyes darting toward the doorway in a silent plea. Mame's mind flashed with the memory of his words, one word, and you're dead, and something cold settled into her bones. She stepped into the room without announcing herself, her voice steady but edged with steel as she asked what he was doing. Jerome straightened, his expression morphing into mock surprise, claiming he was helping with homework, that Mummy's sudden entrance had startled them both. She didn't argue, not yet. Instead, she moved closer, placing herself between him and her daughter, her posture calm but unyielding. She told Amira to fetch her bag from the kitchen, watching as the girl slipped past them, her breath quick and shallow. Jerome lingered, his gaze heavy, as though weighing whether to challenge her. Finally, he smiled again, slow and deliberate, and said he'd better go. She walked him to the door, the air between them charged with unspoken hostility. When the latch clicked behind him, she exhaled for the first time in what felt like minutes, her legs trembling from the effort of holding herself still. That evening, Mame sat with Amira at the kitchen table, the warm light casting soft shadows on their faces. She didn't push her to talk. Instead, she asked about school, about friends, about anything that wasn't him. Slowly, Amira began to speak, her voice tentative at first, then steadier as she described the ways Jerome had found excuses to be near her. Offering rides she didn't want, touching her shoulder when no one was watching, asking questions that felt wrong. Mame listened without interruption, her mind cataloging every detail, every opportunity he had taken. The urge to storm over to his apartment and end it all right there burned hot, but she knew she needed to be precise, careful, and undeniable. 2 mornings later, the opportunity came. Mame told Amira she'd be home late from the clinic, but instead she returned early, her steps quiet on the porch. The blinds were partially drawn, yet through the narrow gap she could see movement. Jerome inside, his back to the window, Amira cornered by the sofa. Her heart pounded in her ears, but her mind was razor sharp as she reached for her phone. She eased the door open just enough to slip in without a sound, her camera app ready. The light in the room was dim, but clear enough to capture his looming posture, his hand reaching toward her daughter's arm. The image burned into the screen, proof she could hold. She stepped forward then, making her presence known. His head snapped up, the mask of charm cracking for a split second before reforming. He greeted her as though nothing were wrong, asking why she was home early, but his tone was tight. She told him the truth, that she had wanted to check on her daughter, and the words hung in the air between them like a gauntlet thrown. He laughed, low and dismissive, and stepped back from Amira, claiming they had been discussing a book she was reading. Mame didn't look at him. She looked at Amira, who clutched the edge of the sofa with white knuckles, her chest rising and falling too fast. When he left, there was no goodbye, only the soft click of the door and the sound of his car pulling away. Mame locked the door, double-checking the bolt, then turned to her daughter. She took her hands, feeling the tremor in them, and promised, quietly but firmly, that this would not happen again. Amira nodded, tears brimming but not falling, and for the first time in days, her eyes held a glimmer of relief. Mame knew the fight ahead would be brutal, but she also knew she had crossed a line. There was no going back, only forward. The next 48 hours felt like a coil tightening around Mame's chest. Jerome hadn't shown up, but his absence was no relief. It was a silence that pressed in, heavy and deliberate, like the calm before a violent storm. She didn't trust it. Every glance out the window felt like scanning for a predator. Every phone vibration sent her pulse racing. Amira tried to act normal, moving between homework and music, yet her gaze flickered often toward the door, as if measuring the distance she'd have to run. Mame kept her voice steady when they spoke, but her mind was already sketching contingency plans, numbers to call, routes to take, places to hide. It was late evening when her phone buzzed with a text from Shanice. Saw Jerome near the school today. He was watching. The words hit like ice water. She typed back quickly, her fingers trembling, asking for every detail. The reply came fast. He'd been leaning against his car across from the gates, sunglasses on despite the clouds, eyes fixed on the entrance. Shanice had recognized the way his posture tilted forward whenever kids came out, but she'd lost sight of him before she could confront him. Mame's mind went into overdrive. Tomorrow was Friday, the day Amira stayed late for an after-school art session. That meant fewer people around, fewer eyes. She couldn't risk it. She made the decision instantly. She would pick Amira up herself, even if it meant rearranging her clinic shift. That night, she lay in bed wide awake, rehearsing exactly how she'd scan the parking lot, how she'd react if he appeared. The ceiling above seemed to press lower with each passing hour, her body wired with an almost painful energy. Friday afternoon came wrapped in gray skies and a biting wind. Memi parked 2 blocks from the school, unwilling to make herself visible too soon. She scanned the street through the rearview mirror, noting every car, every person, every shadow. When the art students began to spill out, their voices rising in laughter and chatter, her eyes locked on Amira stepping through the gates, her sketchbook clutched to her chest. Mame started the engine, but movement to her left made her freeze. Jerome's black sedan was creeping toward the curb, its tinted windows sliding down just enough to reveal his face. He smiled faintly, tapping the wheel with his fingers like he had all the time in the world. Mame pulled out fast, parking diagonally across from them, her door already opening as she called Amira's name. The girl turned, startled, and quickened her pace, but Jerome was already stepping out of the car. His voice carried across the distance, smooth and coaxing, telling Amira he'd promised her mother he'd give her a ride. Mame's blood roared in her ears as she closed the distance, placing herself between him and her daughter. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she spoke in a tone sharp enough to cut, telling him to leave immediately. He laughed, glancing around at the few remaining students, as if daring her to make a scene. Amira's grip tightened on her sleeve, her fingers ice cold even through the fabric. Before Mame could answer, Jerome stepped closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. His words were venom, accusing her of poisoning Amira against him, warning her she couldn't watch forever. Her instincts screamed to push him back, but she forced herself to keep her stance calm and solid. She told Amira to get in the car, never breaking eye contact with him until she heard the click of the passenger door. Only then did she step back, giving him just enough space to turn away. He smiled again, slow and deliberate, before slipping into his car and pulling away like nothing had happened. Mame stood there a moment longer, the cold wind slicing across her face before she climbed in and drove off. They didn't go straight home. Mame drove in looping patterns through side streets, checking her mirrors constantly, only relaxing slightly when she was sure no car followed them. Amira sat silent, staring at her hands until she finally asked if he would come back. Meme told her the truth. Yes, but they would be ready. That night, she called Shanice and explained everything, including the moment in the parking lot. Shanice didn't hesitate. She offered her spare room, suggested they move there temporarily. Mame considered it, weighing the risks of leaving versus staying. Part of her wanted to pack up that very second, but part of her knew running without a plan would only give Jerome more room to maneuver. The following day, she set her plan into motion. She arranged for a neighbor she trusted, Mrs. Alvarez, to keep an eye on the house when she wasn't home, and she programmed the local precinct's number into speed dial. She also sat Amira down and walked her through exactly what to do if Jerome appeared, where to run, who to call, what to say. The conversation was heavy, each word like laying a brick in a wall they hoped they'd never have to climb. But Mame saw something shift in her daughter's eyes, a flicker of resolve replacing some of the fear. It was late afternoon when the phone rang again, and Mame's stomach dropped at the sight of Shanice's name. Her friend's voice was urgent. Jerome was outside the school again, and Amira's art session had ended early. Without a word, Mame grabbed her keys and ran to the car. The drive felt endless, every red light a personal enemy, her knuckles white on the wheel. She spotted them from half a block away, Jerome leaning toward Amira at the curb, his hand reaching for her arm. Mame didn't think. She braked hard, flung open her door, and sprinted toward them. Her shout was sharp enough to freeze both of them in place. She took Amira's hand, pulling her close, and told Jerome that if he came within 10 feet of her again, the police would be the ones answering. He stared at her for a long moment, then stepped back, his smile gone. They left quickly, Mame not daring to look in the mirror until they were on the main road. Back at home, she locked every window and door, then sat with Amira in the living room, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. She knew this was only the beginning of a more dangerous game, but she also knew one thing for certain. Jerome had crossed the line in public, and that gave her leverage. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with something stronger, the determination to end this before it swallowed them whole. The confrontation in the school parking lot replayed in Mame's mind like a loop she couldn't stop, each image sharper in the early morning quiet. Even with the doors locked and curtains drawn, she felt exposed, as if Jerome's presence could seep through walls. Amira moved more slowly now, her once lively chatter replaced by a quietness that unsettled Mame more than any outburst could. The girl kept her sketchbook close, sketching dark shapes that looked like shadows with claws, though she never explained them. The air in the house felt heavier, every sound amplified, the hum of the fridge, the creak of old floorboards, as if the space itself had grown tense. That Friday night, Mame barely slept, jolted awake by every passing car, certain one of them was his. By dawn, her jaw ached from clenching in her sleep. Saturday was meant to be a day for errands, but even stepping outside felt like stepping into a spotlight. At the grocery store, whispers started the moment she walked down the aisle. Two women by the produce section glanced at her, then leaned toward each other, their voices low but sharp enough for fragments to reach her. The words trouble and drama floated between the melons and apples. Mame kept her head high, but her stomach tightened. Jerome's charm had always been his weapon, and she knew exactly how he'd use it now, presenting himself as the misunderstood victim, painting her as paranoid or vindictive. By the time she reached the checkout, she noticed Mrs. Cottrell, an older neighbor, giving her the kind of pitying smile that was almost worse than outright hostility. That afternoon, Shanice dropped by unannounced, bringing coffee and an energy that cut through the heaviness in the air. She sat at the kitchen table, leaning forward, telling Mame she'd heard from a mutual acquaintance that Jerome had been spinning stories, claiming Mame was unstable, prone to imagining threats. The sheer audacity made Mame's pulse spike, but Shanice squeezed her hand, reminding her this was just another tactic to isolate her. Still, the knowledge that gossip was already spreading lit a fire under her resolve. She couldn't just wait for the next move. She had to make one. That thought stayed with her long after Shanice left, echoing like a drumbeat. Sunday morning brought an unexpected visitor, Mrs. Alvarez, the neighbor who had agreed to keep an eye on the house. She looked uneasy, holding a small package. It had been left on her porch by mistake, she explained, but the return address made Mamie's blood run cold. It was blank except for a scrawled "You can't hide" in black ink. Mame took it inside, opening it carefully. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph, Amira walking home from school, unaware of the camera. The shot was slightly tilted as if taken in haste, but the focus was clear enough to see the faint smile on her daughter's face. Mame's hands shook, but she forced herself to think, to file away every detail. The angle suggested it was taken from across the street. The lighting matched the previous Thursday afternoon. Her first instinct was to call the police, but the memory of the last time she'd tried still stung. The polite nods, the notes scribbled without urgency, the quiet suggestion that she might be overreacting. Instead, she photographed the Polaroid and texted it to Shanice, adding only, "He's getting closer." Shanice's reply came almost instantly. "Then we push back harder." That phrase looped in Mame's mind all day, turning from a comfort into a call to action. She began drafting a plan, listing everyone she could trust, every place Jerome wouldn't think to look, and every way she could document his harassment without risking a confrontation. By Monday, the social pressure had thickened into something almost physical. At the clinic where she worked, two co-workers exchanged awkward glances when she entered the break room. One of them, a man named Carl, who'd always been overly friendly, muttered something about keeping drama out of the workplace before walking out. Mamie swallowed her pride, focusing on her tasks, but the tension was like static under her skin. During lunch, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You're making this harder than it has to be." No name, no signature, just that. She deleted it, but the words lingered as heavy as the Polaroid in her kitchen drawer. That evening, as she cooked dinner, Amira asked if they could visit the art store downtown next weekend. Mamie wanted to say yes, to give her daughter a slice of normal life, but the thought of open streets and crowds made her chest tighten. She compromised, agreeing to go only if Shanice could join them. Amira didn't argue, but the shadow in her eyes deepened, as if she could already sense how much of their world was shrinking. Later, while washing dishes, Mame caught her reflection in the kitchen window. Not the confident woman she once was, but someone leaner, sharper, honed by constant vigilance. It was then she realized the truth. Jerome wasn't just trying to frighten them, he was trying to erode them, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to resist. The night ended with a phone call from Mrs. Alvarez. She'd seen a man matching Jerome's description, parked at the end of the block, engine running, lights off. By the time Mame peered through the blinds, the spot was empty, the only sign of movement a swirl of leaves in the street. Still, she stayed up late, seated at the dining table with her laptop, researching protective orders, security systems, and legal advocates. Each new tab was a thread in the web she was building, a net she hoped would hold when the next strike came. And deep down, she knew it would come. The decision to testify wasn't made in a single moment of bravery. It built slowly, like a storm that gathered strength each time Mame remembered the look in Amira's eyes that night. Fear had hollowed her daughter's voice for too long, and Mame knew that silence had become Jerome's shield. By midweek, she sat at the kitchen table with Shanice across from her, the laptop open to an online form for victim statements. The cursor blinked like a challenge, daring her to turn what they had endured into words that would hold up under the glare of a courtroom. Outside, the wind rattled the branches against the siding, and she felt each sound as if it were a warning, reminding her of how close he still was. But she typed anyway, her fingers stiff at first, then steadier, describing every incident in exact, unsparing detail. Shanice read over her shoulder, murmuring small affirmations, each one like a brick laid in the wall Mame was building between them and him. The police station smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee gone stale. The overhead lights were too bright, bleaching the color out of the room and giving it the lifelessness of a hospital waiting area. Detective Harris, a stocky man in his 40s with a voice like gravel, led them to a small interview room. Mame noticed the details instantly: the single camera in the corner, the legal pad on the table, the way the metal chair legs scraped across the linoleum floor. She kept her voice even as she spoke, but her heart thudded against her ribs in a rhythm that wouldn't match her calm tone. Amira sat beside her, fingers laced together tightly, her gaze fixed on the table, as if afraid that looking up would break her resolve. The detective began with routine questions, but when he asked about the night Mame had walked in on Jerome, the air in the room changed, thicker, more charged. Amira's voice wavered at first, but when she saw Mame's steady posture beside her, something shifted. She began describing the scene, her words halting but precise: the position of the door, the expression on Jerome's face, the pressure of his hand on her neck. Her knuckles whitened around her fingers, but she didn't stop. Mame listened without interrupting, each sentence striking like a match, igniting a mix of rage and pride inside her. When Amira faltered, Detective Harris didn't rush her. Instead, he slid a box of tissues across the table, his pen still poised above the notepad, ready for whatever came next. By the time Amira finished, her voice was hoarse, but her back was straighter. Leaving the station felt like stepping into sunlight after days of rain. The sky was a pale winter blue, and the cold air stung their cheeks, but it carried a sense of sharp clarity. Shanice met them at the curb, her car idling, the heater already on. She didn't ask for details. She didn't need to, but she reached back from the driver's seat to squeeze Amira's hand, a small gesture that carried more weight than any speech. As they drove away, Mame spotted a dark SUV parked 2 blocks down. The shape of the driver was obscured, but she felt the prickling certainty that it was him. Her instinct was to tell Shanice to keep driving, but instead she memorized the license plate, committing it to the same mental file where she stored every piece of evidence. That night, Mame sat at her desk with a stack of papers, copies of her statement, the incident report, and the photographs she had managed to take of Jerome's car parked near the house. She organized them meticulously, slipping each into a labeled folder. There was a grim satisfaction in the orderliness of it, as if she were finally taking back a small piece of control. Amira peeked in, asking if she could stay in the room for a while. Not speaking, just sitting on the floor with her sketchbook. The quiet between them was different now, less tense, more purposeful. It felt like they were on the same side of a wall that was finally holding. The following morning, word had already spread in their small community. Mrs. Alvarez called to say she'd heard from someone at the local bakery that Mame had gone to the police. There was no malice in her tone, just concern, but Mom recognized the ripple effect. This would reach Jerome, if it hadn't already. Sure enough, by noon her phone buzzed with a new message from the same unknown number as before. "You think they'll believe you?" She stared at the words for a long moment before deleting them. The difference this time was that she didn't feel the spike of panic, only a deeper resolve. By late afternoon, Detective Harris called with an update. Based on their statements and the physical evidence, the department was recommending an emergency protective order. Mame thanked him, though her mind was already racing ahead. This was only the first step, and she knew Jerome would push back hard. Still, she allowed herself one moment to stand by the window, looking out at the bare branches against the fading sky, and feel the smallest flicker of hope. For the first time in weeks, she could imagine a future that wasn't defined by fear. That night, as she locked the front door, Mame caught her reflection in the hallway mirror. She saw the lines of exhaustion, the shadows under her eyes, but she also saw something harder to erase, the set of her jaw, the steadiness in her gaze. She thought of Amira's voice in that interview room, carrying words that had taken all her courage to speak. And in that moment, she knew that the real victory wasn't just in getting Jerome into a courtroom. It was in refusing to let him steal the truth from them. The courthouse smelled faintly of polish and old paper, the air dry and charged like a storm waiting to break. Mame sat between Shanice and Detective Harris at the long wooden bench, her palms resting flat on her skirt as if anchoring herself. Ahead, the heavy oak doors to the courtroom stood closed, their brass handles glinting under harsh ceiling lights. Amira leaned forward, her knees pressed together, her breath quick but controlled, eyes fixed on the floor as if she could will herself into focus. Every sound in the corridor seemed too loud, the shuffle of shoes, the echo of distant typewriter keys, yet none of it touched the silence inside them. Mame's mind replayed the months leading to this moment, each scene cut sharp and unblinking. The fear, the threats, the night she walked in, and everything changed. Inside, the judge's bench loomed under the seal of the state, its edges catching thin shafts of light from tall windows. The jury filed in, faces composed but lined with the weight of deliberation. Jerome sat at the defense table, his suit pressed, his expression calm in a way that only deepened Mame's resolve. The prosecutor, Ms. Turner, rose first, her voice steady, yet edged like glass as she laid out the final argument. Each fact like a nail, each detail another knot tightening the case around him. Mame's gaze flicked to Amira as Turner recounted her testimony, the precision of her words stripping away the last of his disguise. When it was the defense's turn, the lawyer's tone shifted, soft and reasonable. But the fabric of his argument frayed under the weight of evidence. The judge's voice, when the verdict came, was almost too calm for what it carried. Guilty on all counts. The words landed with a quiet finality that rippled through the room like a drawn breath. Jerome's composure cracked for a fraction of a second, his jaw tightening, his eyes flicking toward Mame. But it was enough. The bailiffs moved in, the cuffs clicking shut, the sound sharp in the charged air. Mame didn't smile, but the weight pressing down on her chest loosened in a way that was both strange and certain. She felt Amira's fingers curl into hers, not in fear but in recognition of what they'd taken back. Outside, the air was cold but clean, the sunlight stark against the courthouse steps. Reporters clustered near the bottom, their cameras flashing, voices rising, but Harris guided them around the edge, his solid frame absorbing the noise. Shanice walked ahead, her stride measured, and when they reached the car, Amira leaned against the door, her breath fogging in the air as she whispered something only Mame could hear. "We're free." It wasn't a statement of fact, but of choice, the beginning of something not defined by him. In the days that followed, the house felt different. The shadows in the hallway no longer clung to the corners, and the air no longer hummed with an unspoken tension. Mame rearranged the furniture in the living room, not out of necessity, but to claim the space anew. She and Amira planted winter herbs in pots along the kitchen window, their scent a constant reminder of growth, even in the cold. Shanice stopped by every evening, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with nothing but conversation, her presence an unshaken thread in the fabric of their recovery. Yet healing was not linear. There were nights when Amira still woke suddenly, her breath shallow, her eyes wide at shadows that weren't there. On those nights, Mommy would sit beside her until dawn, the quiet holding them more gently than words could. She began to write in a journal, not to record the fear, but to track the moments that felt like progress. The day Amira laughed without hesitation, the first morning she opened the curtains herself, the sound of music playing in her room again. Each entry was a step forward, small but certain. When the protective order arrived in official print, Harris brought it himself, standing in the doorway with the paper in hand. He didn't linger, only said, "You did the hard part," before leaving. Mame placed the document in a drawer she could reach easily but didn't need to open. The real protection wasn't in ink and legal stamps. It was in the knowledge that they had faced him and remained unbroken. One Sunday they walked through the market, weaving between stalls bright with winter produce and the smell of bread baking somewhere close. Amira stopped at a table covered in second-hand books, her fingers running along the spines before she picked one and smiled. It was a small, quiet thing, but Mamie felt it as a landmark, the choice to reach for something simply because it brought her joy. The past was still part of them, but it no longer dictated the map of where they could go. That night, as they sat together with a book open between them, the house wrapped them in a stillness that felt earned. Mame knew there would be days ahead that tested them again, but the verdict had marked a line they would not step back over. Healing wasn't the absence of pain. It was the decision, again and again, to move through it towards something better. And in that, they had already won. The morning was different, not because the sun rose earlier, but because the air carried no shadow. Mame stood at the kitchen counter, her hands wrapped around a warm mug, the steam curling in delicate ribbons toward the ceiling. Through the window, the street was waking, neighbors greeting each other, the sound of a delivery truck rumbling past, the crisp scent of early spring drifting in. Amira was upstairs, the faint sound of her humming spilling down the staircase, the tune unsteady yet real. Mame closed her eyes for a moment, letting the quiet strength of the house settle into her bones, and realized this was the first day in a long time she didn't feel watched. The walls no longer seemed to hold their breath. They exhaled with her, as if sharing the relief. By midday, the small living room had transformed into a space alive with motion. Shanice arrived first, her arms full of folded fabric swatches for the curtains she insisted they needed. Harris came not long after, balancing a box of tools and grinning in a way that softened his usual seriousness. Amira bounced between them, pulling out books from the box labeled donations and stacking them in a neat pile by the door. They worked without speaking much about the past, yet every nail hammered, every picture frame hung was a quiet declaration that this was their space now. Mame watched from the corner, her heart swelling in a way that felt both foreign and familiar. She didn't need to direct them. They understood the rhythm of rebuilding without her saying a word. In the afternoon, they walked together to the park 2 streets over. The grass was patchy from winter's hold, but small green shoots pushed stubbornly through the soil. Amira carried a sketchbook, stopping at a bench beneath a budding maple tree to draw. Shanice sat beside her, leaning in to ask about the shapes taking form on the page. Mame stood a few steps away, the sound of children's laughter drifting from the playground, the air filled with the distant scent of cotton candy from a vendor's cart. Harris lingered near the path, hands in his pockets, scanning the scene not out of suspicion, but habit. It struck Mame that even here, in the openness of daylight, she no longer felt the instinct to check over her shoulder. The danger had been real, but so was its ending. That night, as they returned home, the hallway light flickered, and for a split second, her chest tightened. Yet instead of spiraling into old fear, she stepped forward, reached up, and tightened the bulb with a twist of her fingers. It was a small act, but the control in it settled something deep inside her. Amira noticed, and though she said nothing, her smile lingered just long enough for Mame to feel it was understood. In the kitchen, Shanice brewed tea while Harris checked the lock on the back door, the simple domesticity weaving a fabric stronger than anything fear could tear apart. The house didn't just feel safe, it felt owned, claimed, lived in. In the following days, the pace of life shifted. Amira enrolled in an evening art class at the community center, and Mame started helping at the weekend farmers market. She liked the way people greeted her by name, the way they remembered her order for fresh bread, the way conversations began with nothing more than the weather, and yet built into something warm. Shanice teased her about making friends too quickly, but Mame knew this was the kind of connection she had been starved for. Harris stopped by less frequently, but when he did, it was to share stories about his own life rather than to check on hers. That, more than anything, told her they were moving forward. One Sunday morning, Mame woke to the sound of rain tapping the windows. She padded into the living room to find Amira curled up on the couch, sketching by the soft glow of the lamp. Shanice's scarf hung on the back of a chair, a forgotten token from her last visit. Mame wrapped herself in a blanket and sat beside her daughter, watching the pencil move across the page. The drawing was of their house, not the house as it had been, heavy and closed, but as it was now, windows open, curtains lifting in the breeze, light spilling onto the lawn. She didn't need to ask what it meant. Later that week, they planted flowers in the front yard. Neighbors stopped to offer advice, some bringing extra seedlings from their gardens. The earth was cool and damp under her nails, the smell of it grounding her in the moment. When Amira stepped back to look at their work, her cheeks flushed from the effort. Mame felt a surge of something unshakable, pride not just in her daughter, but in herself. The journey had been brutal, but they had walked it to the end and stepped into something better. On the first warm evening of the season, they ate dinner on the porch. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of gold and rose, and the sound of crickets began to hum in the grass. Shanice arrived with a bottle of sparkling cider, and Harris brought a deck of cards. They laughed, not politely, not cautiously, but freely, and the sound rose into the night air like a flag planted in new ground. Mame leaned back in her chair, the wood warm against her spine, and knew that tomorrow would not be defined by survival alone. As darkness settled, the porch light glowed steadily, and no part of her wondered if it would flicker. They had endured, they had resisted, and now they were more than what had been done to them. This was not the end of the story. It was the place from which all new stories would begin. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. Every journey carries its meaning, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, feelings, or reflections on what you've just read. Your perspective matters, and it may even inspire the next chapter in ways I can't yet imagine. Until we meet again, take care, stay strong, and keep believing in your own story.